Hello and welcome to this exam skills pit stop for Jekyll and Hyde. As part of any exam preparation, you should be practicing writing essays. Then it's a great idea to check you are using the skills the exam board want to see to achieve the grade you want. Just like an F1 car, no answer is going to be perfect on the first time of writing it. Here's a copy of the exam board criteria then. As you can see, it's pretty lengthy and full. I've got the 3 columns there, AO1, AO2, AO3, and the criteria I'm going up to 40 marks in total. To get the pass grade, you kind of need to be scoring in the middle there, around about row 3. Which asks you for things like straightforward approach to the task, beginning to analyse the writer's choice of language, and beginning to understand the relationship between the text and the context in which it was written. Let's look at a better example of that criteria then. Now, as you can see, I've put in bold the main things the exam board are looking for in each of the 3 areas. For AO1, they're looking for you to look past what the novella is about and think about how its themes and ideas inspire and affect you. The examiner wants you to think and feel something as you read it. For AO2, they want you to look at how the effects ideas of the novella are formed through the language choices and language techniques. The examiner expects most of these to come from you talking about words, the words being used, but form and structural choices can also be effective things to comment on. And lastly, AO3. They want you to link the knowledge you have about the novella and the writer and link it to the novella itself. Why was it written? How are the themes personal to the writer? How does the novella link to what the writer was going through as he wrote the story? All of these then really good things to comment on in the test. Now, it's a good idea when writing your answer to highlight it for these key skills. We've got AO2, use of quotes, AO1 and AO2, links to the reader, and AO1, references to the writer, in this case Stevenson, and AO3, links to context. Why would I ask you to highlight the work then in that particular way? Well, AO1, looking for quotes, checks how frequently you use your evidence. But evidence doesn't have to always be a quote. It can be a device or a structural technique, or at its absolute worst, just something really important that happens in the book. By linking to the reader, you're beginning to focus on the effect of the evidence you've chosen. What does it make you think or feel? By linking to the writer, you're beginning to address the writer's reason for writing, the reasons why Stevenson chose the story he did and the way he chose to tell it. And lastly, for Jekyll and Hyde, you'll also mark for background knowledge of the writer, or indeed the time the novella was written. These on the board at the moment are some key phrases that would guide you to a stronger response and challenge you to create a thoughtful response. The worst of them are on the left-hand side. The writer shows, the writer tells us are the weakest answers you could give. I'd strongly advise not to use those sentence structures. The middle ones are slightly better. The writer implies or the writer suggests. But by far the strongest ones the exam board would be impressed by are the ones in green. Words like confronts us with, challenges us to think about, forces us to reflect on, or creates the image of, are really high-level sentence structures the exam board will be looking through your work and expect to find. Think about looking through your essay, your mock examples, and think how often you could have put these phrases in. Some common errors then that I've learnt by reading different exam answers that might be present in your work. Not making enough points about the character or theme. That includes simply not using enough evidence in each paragraph you write. Forgetting some marks are awarded for comments on form and structure. Not making a clear comment on how a theme develops in a text as one chapter builds on the last one. Not really explain the effect of a particular word choice or technique used. It's quite common for a student just to say what a word means rather than saying what it makes them think about. not mentioning or linking to the message or reasons for writing. Stevenson would have a clear message he wants to give you in each chapter, something he wants you to think about or reflect on. You've just got to work out what that message is and explain it to the exam board. Now we're going to look at some examples from a variety of grades and discuss how improvements can be made to each one. This is then example A. I've already colour-coded it in the 4 ways described. Immediately obvious then is the number of quotes, which is quite strong. We've got 1 reference in the middle to history, and we've got a couple of references to the reader and 2 links to Stevenson. Stevenson seems to be mentioned at the beginning of each paragraph. Obviously, this isn't a full answer. This is simply the first and beginning of the second paragraph this candidate wrote. At the beginning of the book, Stevenson creates horror as describing Mr. Hyde to be a murderer is a bold and brutal statement. I know this because the quote, "The man trampled over the child's body," implies that he stamped on an innocent child that has done nothing wrong. This candidate clearly understands then what is happening in this quote. The adverb calmly, good analysis there, 1 keyword selected from a longer quote, suggests he did it as if it was a normal thing to do and didn't care for the child's well-being. Furthermore, the screaming child infers the young person was incredibly frightened of Mr. Hyde. The adjective screaming creates an image of distress, which could mean the kid was calling for help or in excruciating pain. I like the idea of alternatives in that sentence there. This would most likely be influenced by Jack the Ripper, who was a murderer during the same period of time. He killed innocent women as well as Hyde did. This is backed up by it wasn't like a man, it was like a damn juggernaut. This challenges us to think he isn't human because he was turning almost psychotic, like a rampaging wild animal. The reader would be forced to think about the effect on society and the damage of his reputation because he was a respected man. In the middle of the book, Stevenson shows the theme of horror by Mr. Hyde going on rampages around London. Well, that last sentence sounds very much like what's already been said, so I'd wonder whether this candidate is simply going to repeat the same ideas in each paragraph they write. But let's look at the main paragraph we've got. Well, first of all, we notice there are 2 clear areas of improvement. One is not the fact they didn't really explain the effect of a particular word choice or technique, and I felt this candidate did not make enough points about the character or theme. I thought, really, although they've used a couple of good quotes there, they have kind of stuck to the same main point without diversifying. How do you go about it then? Well, I've just divided this answer then into its key quotes. You can see quite a bit was said about the key quotes this student showed, but only one of them actually links it to history, and only one of them actually links to the reader as well. Both of the above targets I've given then link to how a quote is explained. This candidate does not appear to know that many quotes to use, so a much higher level of thought needs to go into what can be said about the quotes that he or she remembers. If only a few quotes are known, then the ideas that link to them need to be much more advanced. When studying the quotes I want to use in the test then, I'd want to make sure I have enough detail. On the board are some key questions that I might ask about this really, really good quote that this candidate has used. There's nothing wrong with the quote itself, but we need to really explore it in much more depth than this candidate did. This is then what I'd come up with. Stevenson has a male destroy the child, so we see the effect of society on the citizens of London. The reader would see this behaviour as irrational and needlessly cruel and unkind. It is incomprehensible that such a horrific act can't be done out of violence and or rage. The sentence ends with child's body, as it's deliberately shocking us as we are outraged by the fact an innocent child is a victim of such cruelty. It is placed at the end of the sentence to emphasise the shock value created. That's then some much more detailed comments I can make on the quote. Let's look at this part of the answer then. This is their next quote they used. Notice I've crossed parts out. These are the parts that were a little bit too vague and so would need improving. Once more, I've added some questions at the bottom there that you should pause the video and reflect on before looking at my next screen. This is how to get detail then out of the quote, screaming child. Stevenson gives us the image of a child in pain on the floor. This exaggerates the agony she is in. This makes us feel pity and sympathy for the child's hatred for the attacker. The child represents the next generation and how Stevenson felt they were doomed by what was happening in London at the time. Quite short quote then, but still quite a lot I can say about it. This is then how I'd write it if I was putting all those ideas together and thinking what more I could say in a lot more depth. Please pause the video and make notes on this if you plan to use the quote "screaming child" in your answer. Once more, I've taken the quote "it wasn't like a man, it was like a damn juggernaut," and I've added my explanations there. Once again, pause the video, make notes on the explanations here, and take note of how they're written and the depth I'm actually going to. Again, this is a really good quote that could be said a lot more about in the exam. This is example B. In the start of the novella, Stevenson creates the image of horror by describing Hyde in the line "really like Satan." This challenges us with the idea that it's anti-religious and unchristian by describing Hyde like the devil. Another quote that creates the image of horror is "ape-like fury," another really good quote. This challenges us with the fact that Hyde is the opposite to Darwin's theory of evolution. Hyde is the opposite, he's devolution. The final quote that creates an image of horror is "trampled calmly under the body." The phrase "trampled" implies Hyde doesn't care about his actions. We don't immediately think this early novella that Hyde would be so violent. The word "calmly" implies that Hyde can be violent, but he can do it calmly and doesn't care. This makes the audience feel that Hyde is hurting people of his own class. In the middle of the novella, Stevenson presents horror by making Hyde more vicious. You can see sometimes the quote is repeated. "Calmly" means he can do it calmly. I'd want this person to think of other words that mean calmly rather than just repeating the same word of the quote. And I'd also need the explanations perhaps to be added to in some depth. Key targets for this candidate then: forgetting that some marks are awarded for comments on form or structure, or not mentioning or linking to the message and reasons for writing. How would I correct that? What would I do to improve? Well, once again, I've split this answer up into its key quotes, and you'll notice only one of them is really analysed in much depth. Here then, in orange, is how I talk about the message of the writing. I've now added in why Stevenson wants to write the book in the first place and what he makes us think about. Stevenson wants to make clear his message that Hyde is the opposite to good and suggests that Victorian London could be being taken over by the devil. Like Satan, to challenge us to see that Hyde is unreligious and unchristian, as if Stevenson wants us to see Jekyll's experiments as the opposite of godliness. Notice it adds a lot more depth to the answer and equally uses the word Stevenson to explain why the writer chose this particular quote to use in his novel. How else could I do this? Well, I've taken the quote "ape-like" and thought how I could link that to ideas of perhaps Darwin or perhaps Stevenson's message. So I've got starting sentences like, by using the phrase "ape-like," Stevenson wants us to think about. He then juxtaposes this with fury, which suggests. In this case, ape-like fury, it's interesting it goes in that particular order. You've got the scientific ape-like next to the religious idea of fury. If that was explained, then that would be a lot more depth. That would give a lot more depth to this response. Now, in blue, I've now added some ideas about structure. Now, structure means the order in which the book happens and how the quotes being chosen here link to what happens before the quote and indeed afterwards. So this answer then becomes, Stevenson deliberately develops this idea of aggression by forcing us to imagine unspeakable acts of brutality committed by Hyde, trampled calmly under the body. The phrase "trampled" implies Hyde doesn't care about his actions. We don't immediately think, this early in the novella, that Hyde would be so violent. The word "calmly" implies Hyde can be violent, but he can do it without emotion and doesn't care. This makes the audience feel that Hyde is hurting people for no reason, as if he's doing it for fun. Stevenson wants us to explore the meaningless violence on the streets of London and the lack of responsibility people show for each other. Despite starting so violently, Stevenson continues to develop the sense that Victorian London is a scary place to live. You can see I've added in there a link to the message as well as the structure. Example C. You can see this has got a good quote to use, links a lot to the reader, and once again links once to Stevenson. I would give the following comments then. This candidate does not make enough points about the character or theme and doesn't really explain the effect of word choices. I've now added bits in blue that I could add. In this case, this candidate clearly did not know enough quotes, so I've had to take parts of the book to explain instead. If you can't think of quotes, at least try and explain the events that happened before and after the quote you do know. So I've added in blue the following. Stevenson sets up the scene by first describing a strange place that Hyde lives in and making it sound as evil as possible. He wants the tension to build before we learn about Hyde's crimes. Finally, we see from the maid's point of view how bad the man himself is. Notice I'm linking to what happened before the act of violence against the small girl, before going on to the quote itself. At the end, I've added, we know it is the first violent, horrific act that starts Utterson's investigation into Hyde and gets his curiosity, as this act of violence is so unimaginable that this lawyer, like Utterson, wouldn't be able to move on until the criminal was found. I've just explained the answer in a bit more depth, using what I know about the events before and after the quote. Of course, ideally, more quotes to be learned, so I don't have to take this quite drastic step to improve. If I then add in links to the reader and the message, I can now add in then something about the bits in orange there. So once more I've added in, this challenges us to see Hyde as a man without remorse or feelings, as he appears to have no morals. This is effective as it makes Hyde clearly evil, so we can side with Utterson in tracking him down. And I've also added an explanation of how the word trampled is effective. This is effective as it makes Hyde sound like a group of people rather than one person, perhaps hinting he represents all of society. If you now read through his answer in full, despite the fact I only know one quote, I've now explained it in much more depth, so at least for AO1 I'd get a lot more marks from it. Once more, pause the video, make notes on the ideas I've got here. Lastly, example D. Now this is the weakest of the three. It uses only two short quotes, clearly doesn't link to the reader, and doesn't really explain those quotes in any detail at all. So how would we improve this one? Well, certainly this candidate needs to go away and learn more quotes and get to know the book a little bit better. There are some key errors here that mean that the response could be added to in many ways, but most importantly, the novella and the messages in it need to be revised in a lot more depth. The quotes used here are really strong, but more needs to be known about the novella to enable her to use them correctly. So I've now got the answer they wrote in the middle, and I'm going to fill this page then, or this screen, with lots of ideas that they could take away and revise to make sure that this answer massively improves. Now, if this person was to go away and revise all of the questions on the board there, this would turn this fairly easy answer into a much, much stronger response. This is also a good exam technique for those of you who know a bit more about the book and could then use this as a starting point to begin your revision for your actual GCSE test. Which brings me on to revision strategies that you could use. 1. Read the book and make a list of key plot points that happen in order and the order they appear in. Highlight these plot points in different colours for different themes: secrecy, violence, horror, religion, science. Choose 8 to 10 great quotes to learn that cover the above themes. Brainstorm and practice writing what you'll say about them and have them checked by your teacher to prove they get a great grade. 4. Create a context or history revision sheet that gives you 5 historical interesting ideas that you can link to the events of the book. If you were to do this, then you'd be in a great place to succeed in this test. As part of any exam preparation, you should be writing practice essays, and it is a great idea to check that you are using the skills the exam board want to see to achieve the grade you want. Just like an F1 car, no answer is going to be perfect first time, but by practicing it, both the timings you'd use in the test and the quotes you plan to use in the real exam, that guarantees you the chance of doing really, really well and passing this test with flying colours. After all, you just want to get over the finishing line with the best grade you possibly can. Thank you very much for listening then to this pit stop linked to Jekyll and Hyde.